It's a real honor to be here today to introduce a leader who's at the very forefront of keeping warfighters equipped with technology and capabilities they need to maintain our global security. The Honorable Frank Kendall is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Under his leadership, the DoD has taken its better buying power initiatives to extremely new heights, driving a greater focus on agility and responsiveness in a rapidly changing world, igniting creativity and innovation in research and development, strengthening healthy competition and collaboration across the entire industrial base, ensuring the DoD is gaining as much value as possible for every dollar that they invest in acquisition. Secretary Kendall is the consummate acquisition executive. As an Army veteran, he understands the needs of the warfighter. As an engineer, he knows the ins and outs of the technology that he delivers. As a lawyer, he has a keen grasp on policy and contract strategy. And as a former industry executive, he knows the value and the perspective of the industrial base. Secretary Kendall appreciates the critical role space plays in global security. And we're very fortunate to have him here today to share his perspective with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Frank Kendall.
Rick, thank you. Janice, thank you also. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to talk just for a few minutes and then take questions. And I have the sense from the buzz in this room that there'll be plenty of questions, so I don't need to worry about that too much. I will not be taking questions on Guantanamo, however, for those of you here from the press. But we'll stick to space today, I hope. I want to just mention 2 or 3 points or cover 2 or 3 areas very quickly. The first one is, and I'm not going to spend much time on this, is to talk a little bit about our budget. Then I want to talk a little bit about how that and the current situation in the world, some of the things that are driving our budget are also driving what we're doing in space in general. And then I want to spend a few minutes on space launch, because there's been some, I think, confusion. It's a very complicated area that's become politically difficult to work our way through. I want to clarify where the department is on that. Okay, so let me start with the budget. What Secretary Carter did with this budget was, I think, bring us back to what, in my earlier stages of my career during the Cold War, was more the norm, which is a threat-oriented budget. You know, at the end of the Cold War, we talked a lot about what we should use as the basis for planning for the defense establishment, what kind of capabilities should we have, and so on. And we settled on a way of talking about our capabilities that was built around regional contingencies. We're kind of vague about which ones necessarily, but we had 2 simultaneous regional contingencies. It was sort of what drove us for a long time. Over time, we shifted our emphasis obviously towards counterinsurgencies and the fights we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq and all that we've been committed to there in counterterrorism and extremist groups. And while that was going on, something I've been talking about for years now, some of our more peer competitors potentially, or possible adversaries, were modernizing in ways that challenge our technological superiority, particularly China and Russia. So what Secretary Carter has done is bring us back to a threat-focused budget. And he talks about 5 problems that he sees in the world. And I've already mentioned three of the 5. China and Russia as possible peer competitors. North Korea, excuse me, I don't want to get that wrong. North Korea and Iran as regional contingencies we might have to deal with. And then the threat of extremist groups like ISIL. So he's tried to strike a balance in the budget that balances all of those competing requirements, but it's specifically threat-focused. Those scenarios vary. The time frame in which those potential adversaries have whatever capabilities varies, and you have to think about all that and try to get the balance right. So that's what we've done. It's been more threat-focused. One of the areas in which we are much more threat-focused today is space. And the reason for that is the degree to which China in particular, but also Russia, have been building anti-satellite capabilities. And we have operated in space for quite a long time now with relative impunity. When I was in the Pentagon in the 80s, actually, during the Cold War, I had a program that I was responsible that was a U.S. anti-satellite program. And it was canceled because of concerns about an arms race in space as much as anything. The Soviet Union did have an anti-satellite they deployed, but it's relatively small numbers. And there was a perception that we could manage that situation without doing much more on our side. In that intervening period of over a quarter of a century, we have assumed, for the most part, impunity in space, that we could operate there safely without being seriously challenged. That assumption isn't valid anymore. This is an issue that Secretary Carter and I were discussing earlier in the administration. When he was Deputy Secretary, he put together a presentation on the intelligence associated with this. He went over and he briefed it to the President, who has become quite concerned about this. So this is at the highest levels of the administration, something that is driving what we're doing now. And the full spectrum of capabilities that we're worried about includes on-orbital capabilities, it includes soft kill like jamming and cyber attacks, it includes ground-launched anti-satellites. And these aren't hypothetical things, these are things that have been or are being fielded that we can see. So that changes the environment fundamentally. The policy guys have, and I was trying to remember the third C, but contested and what are the others? Somebody want to help me with this? I'm sure you know this. Competitive, congested, and contested, right? They like alliteration in the policy side of the house. Well, those words are all true. And so there's a fundamental change for us in terms of the environment that we have to operate in. And resiliency, as we call it, has become much, much more important to us. And we're looking at a variety of ways to try to build that into our architectures. We're also at a point where we have a number of our satellites that are basically in what I would call serial production or close to that. You know, we've gone through periods where we struggled with development, trying to get satellites through the design and transition to production process. And for the last few years, it's been, for the DoD at least, generally serial production. The intelligence community is generally in a similar mode. So we're facing decisions about what to do next about some of these constellations. The two that are on the table for us right now, and the intention is to make decisions within this administration about the follow-on programs, are the SBIRS program, the early warning program, and the AHF secure communications program. These are both DoD responsibilities. And we are now in the process of working our way through figuring out what to do about the follow-ons to those systems. And one of the things that is really driving our thought processes is the changing nature of the threat in space and how we're going to respond to that. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention. We haven't made final decisions about those yet, but we intend to over the next several months. The other thing that's changing in space, and this actually is not quite as clear in terms of where it's going to go, but this room, I think you're very, very aware of this, is the commercial space and what's happening in commercial space. I was talking to Rick earlier, I won't betray what he said to me, about whether this was real or not. But I think that's to some degree still an open question. However, if it is real, and if the hundreds or even thousands of space satellites that people are talking about putting into orbit are actually going to be there, that fundamentally changes the environment in which our systems would operate. And that has some effect on my concerns about resiliency and the survival of some of our assets. And there are several ways in which we can take advantage of the proliferation, if it happens, of satellites for commercial purposes. So we're talking to commercial enterprises, and we're trying to position ourselves to take advantage of that if it does. Meanwhile, we have to obviously figure out what to do about the systems that we need to move on to the next generation of. So that's very much a work in progress. I want to turn for a few minutes to space launch and talk about that. This has become, unfortunately, politically contentious for a number of reasons. And I just want to lay out fairly clearly where the department is on this and what we're trying to accomplish. A few years ago, we made a decision to allow a joint venture to be formed from Lockheed and Boeing to form ULA. So I know you're here, ULA. And ULA has given us remarkably reliable launches for quite some time. You know, I think we're up to over 100 successful launches in a row now. So that assured access to space is very important to us. But it's also very important to us to have competition and to control costs. And for coming out of the commercial world, SpaceX, who's here also, I know, has provided some competition to ULA that didn't exist before. And just the emergence of that threat has done a lot, I think, to focus ULA and to bring costs down. And that's a very positive thing. But now we're looking forward, and we're thinking about where do we go from here? What's the next generation look like? To some degree, the commercial world is going to be investing in access to space. And it will depend in some extent on the thing I talked about a moment ago, by what happens to commercial space in terms of the numbers of satellites and replenishment rate for them and so on. So there's an unknown in the business market there that may be a driver on this. There seem to be fairly strong commitments to some of the new constellations. And if those pay out, I think there's going to be a very vibrant and much richer market for space launch. We want to take advantage of that. At the same time, there's some uncertainty to be dealt with there. So we looked at the situation and working closely with the Air Force on this and concluded over a year ago, I think now, that the right course for the department was to try to leverage what was happening in the commercial market. And the concept that we came up with is called public-private partnerships. The idea there is that we will team with competitively selected launch service providers to help them close their business case in return for some assured pricing for future launch options. That's the basic business deal. It's a very non-traditional thing for DoD to do. And unfortunately, I think we've had a hard time communicating this to people because everybody wants us to go out and buy rockets and buy engines. We don't want rockets or engines. We want people to put our satellites in space for us. That's what we want to contract for. We want to help people get there so they can give us competitive, affordable, and reliable launch services. That's our strategy. Well, what has muddied the water enormously is the situation with regard to Russia and the RD-180. We are unfortunately, and this is a decision that was made a long time ago when the relationship with Russia was very different, that we could rely on the RD-180, and at the time it was put in place, it was intended to be temporary, for the Atlas rocket, one of our very reliable ways of getting things into space, for lighter and intermediate payloads, of course. So we were in the situation with RD-180 and a reliance on Russia when Russian behavior has changed our attitude towards Russia substantially. And sanctions have been put in place. At this time, sanctions do not affect our ability to buy the RD-180, although there's been that issue has been raised. As far as we can tell, in consultations with the Treasury Department, and we're waiting for a very final formal opinion on this, at this point in time, sanctions do not affect our access to the RD-180. But the fact that it comes from Russia is raised some obvious concerns and understandable concerns. So our view has been that until we can find a replacement, we need to continue to rely on the RD-180 as the most cost-effective way for us to get some of our payloads at least into space. And that temporary period of time is the next several years. Now, the obvious course of action that one would think about, and saying, well, you have a problem with an engine, why don't you get another engine? There are several problems with that. One is that that's fairly expensive, and it takes a very significant amount of time to do it. And if we did buy an engine, it would be associated with a launch vehicle and would be essentially subsidizing one launch service provider. We would prefer not to do that. We prefer to take a more general approach. So our strategy could end up conceivably in the same place, more or less, depending upon what kinds of proposals we get competitively. But we do not want to be locked into just developing an engine and providing it essentially as a government-funded, GFE perhaps, asset for people to purchase. So we're in the middle of that, and we're working our way through that. The other possibility for us is the Delta as an alternative to Atlas. The problem with that is that it's much more expensive, as I think is well known. And that is just a temporary measure. We still want to get onto, and I think the industry agrees with us on this, get onto more efficient and more effective, more modern launch systems in the future. So anyway, we're trying to work our way through this minefield. We've gotten some specific guidance from the Congress, which we have followed. We have been obeying the law, but we've been at the same time arguing with Congress to give us a more general approach, the strategy that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So that's where we are in space launch. Secretary James and I from the Air Force recently had a hearing with the SASC on this, tried to explain the government's position and our views. And I'm hopeful that we can work our way through this and get to a place that makes sense. And I think, frankly, at the end of the day, it's in the public's interest, it's in the country's interest, it's actually in the launch service provider's interest to go down the course that I outlined. You know, we want to close your business case, do it. We want to do it competitively. That's in the taxpayer's interest. We want to end up in a position where we have domestically produced launch services that we can take advantage of, and that can also service, hopefully, this commercial market that's emerging. So that's in a nutshell, what we're trying to accomplish. And if you have questions about that, I'd be happy to take them. So I'm going to wrap up there. It is the last year of the administration. We are going to try to get some decisions made in this administration. I generally am now dividing things, though, into two categories. Things we want to decide this administration, things we don't. But the things where we've built up an expertise and have a strong sense of what the right thing to do is, we want to move forward on. And both of the areas that I described are areas where I feel that we're in that position. So thank you, and I'll be happy to entertain your questions. Oh, no, I'm not supposed to do press questions. Hi, Andre, I knew you'd have one. I'll catch you on the way out. Okay.
Sir, so you mentioned your hearing at the SASC, and one of the issues that came up there was the possibility of allocating some number of launches to help bridge that, the future when you get to the more competitive.
Yeah, our first requirement is assured access to space, which means we want 2 reliable sources of space launch. And we can easily get into a situation where competition is not going to sustain that because of the inherent economic advantage one company might have over another. So in that situation, we would consider allocation to the less cost-effective provider to keep some capability. We'd want to do as little of that as was necessary, right? And that's something we'd have to sort out. We'd have to feel comfortable that really was necessary, that there really was a need for some allocation before we did that.
Sir, the speed of acquisition still seems to be bogged down by classic process versus trying to do it the way a commercial capability could offer. Is there any process you have in play right now to help speed the acquisition process to do commercial data buys or commercial process?
Our acquisition cycle time is actually coming down. And there are a lot of myths about acquisition. I could spend a half an hour on that. But if you look at the data, I publish a report every year that has an enormous amount of data about how we're doing it. And I've been doing that for about 3 years now. The data does show that acquisition cycle times are coming down. Contracting times, however, have not. It takes us a while to get a contract out. And when I started out in this business, it was about half the time it is now. What we generally do when we have lead times like that is we just start earlier, so the net impact is less. I was up on the Hill recently talking to Congressman Thornberry, chairman of the HASC, and some congressmen in a roundtable that he held. And I told him that the most significant thing that I thought that Congress could do to help us shorten cycle time was to let us start earlier. And I'm frustrated by the fact that because of new start constraints and so on, if we're going to do anything with a weapons system, say, we have to put something into the budget and wait for a budget to be approved. By the time you start doing that and you actually have money that you can spend, it's about 2 years. We could cut a lot of that off, and it would be free if we were just allowed to start things and limit our commitments to that early stages of work until we can go through a budget cycle so that we can get started much faster. We are looking at ways to do contracting more quickly. The Air Force has awarded 2 other transaction authorities in the area of space propulsion recently, and they have some more pending that we hope to announce soon. Other transaction authority is a way to do non-traditional, non-FAR governed, Federal Acquisition Regulation governed contracts. There are good things and bad things about that. There are some restrictions on what we can do with them. They're generally restricted to research and development or to prototyping. And they're basically written the way a commercial contract would be written. They're kind of a clean sheet of paper approach with the terms that the parties agree to. And so they are appropriate for some things, and they're a faster way to do business. We were talking about the DIUX organization earlier at my table. Secretary Carter has challenged us to find faster ways for that organization and others to apply money to technology. And we're looking at some things that could be done there, either within current statute or with some changes to statute. I also am looking at the contracting lead time. I've asked Claire Grady, who's my head for procurement, to take a look at what it is that's causing it to take so long. And we have asked the Congress for some relief on some of the requirements they put in place, but it's essentially a lot of things you have to do with audits prior to an award. There's a backlog for that delays things. It's a capacity issue. Right now I have a problem across the DoD in capacity in contracting. It's just the numbers of people. And there are 2 bad consequences of not having adequate resources there. One is you tend to get poorer contracts, and the other is that it takes you longer to get them. And both of those are problematic as far as I'm concerned. We're a bit penny wise and pound foolish in this regard. the Congress has told us that we have to reduce all our headquarters by 25%. And in some cases, contracting organizations are parts of headquarters. So we're cutting by 25% our capacity to award contracts. There's a perception that headquarters are evil and they're full of people who don't do anything. That's not the case at all. But anyway, we're complying with the law, but there is a mission impact because of that.
Another contracting question, since you're on it. Are you concerned at all that we have a community of acquisition officers that can judge that value that you're talking about, balancing the low cost with meeting mission requirements? Or do you feel like we could run into some issues with the LPTA and kind of falling in love with savings and things like that?
Yes, but we've done a lot about that. Okay, there are two or three things. LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable, is basically the type of contract we should use when we want only a certain minimum level of capability or performance. And we know how to define that very objectively. So we're not prepared, we're not interested in, we're not willing to pay any more than the minimum to get that level. We don't see any value to the government in having more performance or higher capability. That's a relatively limited number of things for us, frankly. And most of the things we do, we're interested in best value, which is a trade-off between the cost we have to fund and the performance that we're getting. One of the things that, and I put out a lot of guidance on this to the workforce. I know you may have seen some of those memos. One of the problems we have is that LPTA is an easier contract to write. It's an easier source selection to do. So if you're under stress and you have to process all the things that you have to process, there's a tendency, I think, to default to it in some cases. The other thing we've done, though, which I think is working really well, it's part of one of the Better Buying Power initiatives, is the idea of providing a monetary definition of best value and performance. And I started this 2 or 3 years ago with an Air Force program. I don't know that we've done it in space for anything yet, but we've done it on a number of programs. We did it on the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle that the Army did. We did it on the Advanced Amphibious Vehicle that the Marine Corps did. And essentially what I've forced the operational community to do, the requirements people, the customers for these systems, is to tell the acquisition people, what they're willing to pay for higher levels of capability. How much is it worth to you? If they're 10% more range payload, in the thing that you're buying, how much are you willing to pay for that? Which is interesting because nobody'd ever asked them that question before. Now, it turns out that when you do a source selection, you have to figure that out anyway. We have a tendency in our source selections historically to say, well, high, medium, and low, and then you have dollars over here, and you kind of magically put those together. The problem with that historic approach is that we default to the lowest cost because it's easier to do that, and people don't even bid above that. Our requirements are usually written with a threshold requirement and an objective requirement. The threshold is what you'll accept. It's the lowest you're willing to take, and the objective is what you'd really like to have. So obviously, if the objective were free, you'd prefer to have that relative to the threshold, but it never is. So, and I've had this experience in industry when I was working for one of the major defense contractors. We had a superior product to our competitor. We knew it was a better warfighting product. There wasn't any doubt in our minds of that. But there was no way to get credit for that in the source selection. And I lobbied at the time. I was working for industry could do that. I think that's the right word. For the Pentagon, to try to get the Pentagon to put some way in the source selection criteria of giving us credit for the superior performance, and they didn't do it. So essentially, you default to the threshold, and people have generally in industry been doing that for a long time. So what we're doing now is we're telling industry how much more we're willing to pay for higher performance. So if you can give me twice as much range payload, I'm willing to pay 20% more for that. Okay, so you get credit for that in the source selection process. So you get an adjusted evaluated price, basically. We've done that several times, and it's worked very well for us. We're going to continue to do that. So that's one way to give industry the information industry needs to make a decision about what to bid. I mean, you're not going to give us higher performance unless you think it improves your chance of winning. So what we have to do is tell you, what that equation looks like, and then you can make an intelligent decision. It's interesting because the first time I did it, I kept getting cost estimates back. People were trying to, they give me a cost estimate for the higher performance. I don't want that. That is irrelevant to the question I'm asking. The question I'm asking is, what are you willing to pay for it? Which is the way we all buy anything in our own personal lives, right? But it's been a new thing for the operational community to accept that. And it also forces them to confront the relative value of their requirements, which ones they really care about, that they're willing to put the department, the military department's money on the table for. So anyway, we're trying to move in the right direction, away from LPTA where it's inappropriate, but resource constraints are a factor there. I had one over here, I thought. Yep.
Thanks for your leadership on the launch business. Could you talk a little bit about the military satellite communication and strategy, acquisition strategy? Do you have public-private partnerships in mind for that?
Great question. We've looked at commercial SATCOM quite a bit. We've got some pilots ongoing right now about different ways to buy commercial SATCOM. If you look at the hierarchy of what we buy, we have AHF at the high end, we have WGS, and then we buy commercial SATCOM as well. And we have MUOS in addition. Those meet a lot of our needs, but particularly in support of the operations overseas, we bought a lot of commercial SATCOM to support that. And we tend to have bought it in a rather inefficient way. Tend to buy it kind of on the spot market, if you will. So we have looked at, I had Katrina McFarland do a study of this a couple of years ago, and she came back and recommended some pilot projects in different ways to acquire SATCOM. I think it's still a work in progress. I think we have to, as part of the AEHF discussion that's going on now in terms of what to do for the follow-on to AHF, we're addressing some aspects of that. But I think we still have a ways to go in terms of sorting out the best way to buy, best mix to buy, and how to best structure those business deals. In general, what we need is more flexibility than we tend to have in our budgets in terms of how we contract and how we spend money, which is something we have to work with the Hill on to make progress on.
Related to that, is that this administration or is that a next administration?
I'm prepared to go to address the commercial SATCOM thing in this administration. I'd like to make progress on that.
Yeah. On MilSatcom and other strategic systems, we've combined tactical and strategic services on common platforms. Now in the age of contested, competitive, and whatever the other C is, it adds a complexity to it. Do you see maybe a different architecture going forward?
It's possible. That's one of the very core questions we're trying to address. And it gets into some very deep and important policy questions. What's being alluded to is the fact that we have systems like, in the case of both SBIRS and AHF, where we have bought these systems, their primary role is part of the strategic deterrent. They're either early warning in the case of SBIRS of a nuclear attack. In the case of AHF, they're secure communications for nuclear war. So that's a relatively narrow requirement. But we have put onto those satellites capabilities to do much more than that, to support tactical users. And so the question is, do we want to retain that architecture? The natural course of our evolutionary course, I guess, of our systems has been to ever more expensive and more capable satellites for these types of missions. And I won't get into the intelligence community side of the house, but you can see there's something, I won't say more about that, but you can speculate about that, I guess. Be careful what I say. But anyway, one of the questions we have is that the right approach for the future, given that these assets are threatened much more than they have been perceived to be in the past? And we don't know, and I can't give you that answer today. I think there are different ideas about this. Personally, I think it's a question that we have to take on and make a decision about. And it gets at whether you want to have acknowledged things that are set aside, if you will, for the nuclear war scenario, the strategic deterrence scenario, and other things that are tactical, or do you want to keep them together in a single platform? Or do you want to do something that just has a large disaggregated constellation that does both functions basically in a very resilient way? So there are various concepts there and various ideas about the right way ahead. That's what we're going to try to resolve, I think, in this administration. Yep.
Question, sir. Along the same vein, the current AEHF and WGS have, I don't want to say relied, but have taken on NATO ally investment that it's allowed the expansion of those fleets. How do you see that going forward when we gear up for the replacement generation?
That's a good question. I'll make a more general comment, okay? We're in a situation where any significant operation we're going to do in the world is not going to be done alone. We will always, I think, fight with a coalition of some kind, which means we need to have shared capability with our partners. One of my favorite programs, which is in pretty good shape right now actually, is the F-35, where we have a large, and it's our leading edge, cutting edge fighter bomber, strike fighter. It's we're sharing a lot of technology with a lot of partners around the world because we expect them to be there with us, to fight with us. We want them to have comparable capability to our own. The same, you can extend that to space and the support that we provide in space. And some of the satellite systems are multinational, WGS, for example, right? So I don't see that changing, but it's one of the factors we'd have to consider as we get into this question about future architectures. Way in the back.
You talked a bit about the commercial architectures that are coming up. What do you want to see to give you more confidence that those are going to actually help meet some of the DoD needs? Is it a business case? Is it a technology that's?
It's a combination of the business case and actual investments and things that kind of demonstrate to you that you're actually going to go do it. When I was in the defense industry in the 90s, my company was involved with Iridium. A lot of us remember that. A lot of us have memories that go back to those constellations. And a lot of enthusiasm for them. In the event, of course, it wasn't nearly as they generally didn't materialize. And people missed the fact that a lot of fiber was being laid globally at the same time as people were trying to build satellites. So I think the things that you mentioned, I don't think we're very far away from having some very solid indications of whether those things are real or not. I know substantial sums of money have already been committed. I think there are people breaking ground and starting to build things. Some things are being built. So whether they're going to materialize in the kinds of numbers and the specific concepts that various enterprises are talking about, I think is still a little bit questionable. But I don't think we're more than 2 or 3 years away from being, my guess, you tell me, this is the space community, having a much stronger indication of where we're going. Way in the back.
You mentioned public-private partnership in launch. And it seems to me we've kind of been down that road with the EELV program where the Pentagon decided to support 2 companies and piggyback on the commercial market. And what we ended up with the commercial market collapse was kind of a shotgun marriage and a monopoly. And I'm wondering how, obviously you're cognizant of that, and so how do you avoid that pratfall or that outcome in the future or something similar?
Yeah, if we're going to have assured access to space with 2 ways of getting everything we put in orbit into orbit, we're going to have to pay for that. And it's a lot less expensive to do that in with a vibrant commercial launch market than there is without it. So the bill is affected by that. The desire to have that doesn't change, however. The department, I didn't mention this, but in the budget, the department's headed towards a very serious affordability problem in a few years. The budgets that we have are kind of acceptable but not great is probably the way I would say it. I'm not sure what Secretary Carter would say, but I don't think he'd be very far away from that. We feel that the stability provided by the Budget Control Act for 16 and 17 is enormously helpful. We've been dealing with a lot of uncertainty. Industry's been dealing with a lot of uncertainty in defense markets for a long time now because of sequestration. There's a pattern has emerged of compromises that aren't as bad as sequestration, but it was only a few years ago that we actually implemented it. And the threat is still there in 18 and out in the law for the next few years. So we're a lot of uncertainty about where our budgets are going. In that context, we're confronting a really big bill starting in 2021 with the strategic deterrent. It's on the order of $15 billion a year that would have to come out of other accounts in the department. And we do not see any way that we can rationally do the things we're asked to do in the world, sustain the forces that we need to have for our commitments, and keep our modernization programs reasonable, and do that at the same time. That's a lot of money coming out of the accounts to do those things. So we're looking for some relief out there. The budget that we're requesting, the 5-year plan, includes a little bit of relief in the final year, 2021, about $3 or $4 billion. So OMB has agreed with the department on that and has given us a little bit of relief in the out years. And the president has agreed with that. But there remains to be seen what's going to happen after that. Our assumption, and I think it's the only logical assumption for us to make, is that we're going to have some more money out there. And that we'll get that through the political process somehow to ensure that we have it. So that longer term is a major concern for us. The cost to maintain multiple launch sources will end up reflecting some trade-offs. Now, we have only had one source for heavy payloads to GEO for quite a while, and we lived with that. So we don't, that's a fact, so you can't dispute that. But we would definitely prefer to have, particularly in the contested situation that we're going to be in going forward as it looks, 2 sources. And we're going to keep working towards that goal. And I think the launch service providers are aware of that, and I think that the major ones are are intent on giving us that kind of capability, both of them. Yep.
Sir, another question on space launch. How do you make sure that the investments that you're making now in these public-private partnerships and OTAs and risk reduction aren't lost if Congress continues to take this in another direction?
Well, part of that is we really need to communicate clearly what our intent is to Congress and try to line up all the different interest groups that are affected by this to support it. And I'm hoping we can do that. I think there is the question of the interim, while we still have to use the RD-180, I would prefer to use the RD-180, and then there's a period after we get off of it. And the department's committed to getting off of it as quickly as we can. The public-private partnerships, I think, are the most efficient and effective way for us to get where we need to go. It's going to require some creative contracting, and we're willing to interact with industry on this. The Air Force sent out a request for information to industry, got some ideas back. They've influenced our thinking and have reinforced the idea that this could be done. So, the next step will be to get out a draft RFP. I hope to do that fairly soon, iterate with industry on that. At the end of the day, I think each of these deals, if you will be tailored to whoever we're working with and their needs. And what we want in return for our funding, basically, and this is still a work in progress, is some not to exceeds at least for future launches. So that we have some guarantees to the extent that we can of future launches and the price we're going to pay for those launches. And we're still working on that. We want to iterate with industry on that to get to something that works for all of us. But I think that's the best way forward, frankly. Not yet, Andre.
Well, you're taking out a reporter's question, so make up your mind.
Yeah, right here, go ahead.
So a question maybe a little bit broader than space, but you mentioned LPTA.
Yeah.
It's the bane of a lot of organizations. Is there any, and you mentioned that, which is an interesting take, that the attrition within the acquisition workforce defaults to LPTA. Is there a mechanism, is there a measurement, is there an initiative to train new staff?
Yeah, we're doing good question. We're doing a lot in that area. The history of this goes back several years, but the department shrank the acquisition workforce too much prior to in the era between the late 90s and the early 2000s. And there are a variety of reasons. I won't go into all that. But starting in around 2007 or 9, if I remember correctly, we started to rebuild the acquisition workforce. There was some leadership out of the Senate Armed Services Committee in particular at the time. The Defense Acquisition Workforce Development Fund was created to help that along. And we were trying to increase the total acquisition workforce, the professional workforce, from about 130,000 to, about 140,000 to 160,000 or so. And we got a little bit better than halfway there. That was contracting people and engineering people to a large extent, and then a few more in some of the other professions. But we brought in a lot of younger people. We brought in a lot of people who were entry level, and we had to train them. Some of those people have left. We trained them, and then they got attractive job offers from industry. So we have built the workforce up, and we have, as I think in a lot of areas in government, a double humped profile, a demographic for the age of our workforce. Where a lot of our older people are near retirement and are leaving, our more senior people. Then there's a valley, and then there are the people we brought in. So we're trying to manage our way through that as that shifts to the right. It is a work in progress. It's just a matter of continuing attention. I spend a lot of time trying to make sure the services sustain the workforce, because it's critical to what we've accomplished over the last few years that we do that if we're going to continue to succeed. I'm trying to make sure the workforce understands that it's appreciated, that its efforts are really important to the country, and that we need very high-quality people there. So there are a number of things that we're doing, but it is definitely a concern. And to get back to the LPTA issue, when you have newer people and they're trying to do it, in a way which they're confident they can get through the system and so on, there's a tendency to go towards the simpler ways of doing business. In many cases, that doesn't get us the best business deal, either for industry or for government. 1 minute? One more question? Okay. Yep.
Hi, sir. Thank you for being here. This is also broader than just space, but the department has had several big wins recently with the GAO upholding the bomber decision and the JLTV as well. So do you see this as reflective of the department's better buying power? And
I love your question, thank you. That's great, I'm gonna finish with this one. Well, one of part of better buying power has always been building professionalism, and it includes in areas like contracted, administration, basically. It's pretty, first of all, let me tell you this, just so you're aware of it. The numbers are that protests rarely succeed. It's about 2 or 3%. And the government, the DOD, is significantly better than the rest of the federal government at having successful outcomes from the government's perspective on protests. So very few protests are successful. We expect protests for some of the bigger, game-changing procurements. I understand why industry would, there's a lot at stake. And I think that the willingness to do protests has probably gone up over the years for a variety of reasons. When I was in a major defense contractor, a couple decades ago, we had a history of never protesting. It was just never done. I would never discourage anybody from protesting if they think they have a legitimate basis to do so. It's fundamental to our responsibility as part of the government and working for the taxpayers that we treat industry fairly and that we follow our rules. So if you think something's wrong in there, I would not tell you not to protest, obviously. Just be aware, that we're trying very, very hard to do it right on our side. We've had some unsuccessful one. I had a very disappointing one a couple of years ago with a light attack aircraft for Afghanistan, the A-29. And what happened there was, the program office had, I think it's fair to say, there's some inexperienced people. They didn't document their decision well, and we lost that one. We have tried to train our people, and we do reviews now to make sure that people have done this. Follow your rules, and then document what you've done, and be able to explain to an independent body, the GAO or court, why you did what you did, and show how that process was fair and how you did everything you said you would do. And when you do that, you're in pretty good shape on a protest. Now, I'm a lawyer. I'm really an engineer and a soldier more than anything else, but I'm also a lawyer, and any litigation has some risk in it, period. So we go into any of these doing our best and thinking we have done a very good case, but it doesn't always come out our way. But our results are very, very positive. I don't know if the last two represent a trend or not, and that's not many data points to me, but I'm encouraged by them, because it shows me that our workforce has done a good job. And I hope that we'll continue to do that. All right, thank you very much.